Hello students, welcome to today's lecture on writing from the margins. Today we will be focusing on Basudev Sunani and his work in Oriya Dalit poetry. So we will be looking at one particular poem by Basudev Sunani, but also generally how Dalit poetry was shaped and reshaped and came to its present form in Oriya Dalit poetry. I am Archat Nanda, an assistant professor at Keshav Mahavidyalaya, University of Delhi. Welcome to the class. So the first thing that we will be looking at is Dalit literature in Oriya. As we are progressing through the course, we are moving across multiple languages to see how Dalit lives find literary expression in various languages. We have spoken about Kannada, Telugu, and today we will be discussing the presence of Dalit literature in Oriya language. The first phase of anti-caste literature in Oriya can be traced back to the pre-colonial period. Even the first major poet in Oriya, Sarala Das, belonged to the Shudra caste, and he composed the major epics of Maharamayana and Mahabharata in the Oriya literature. While these epics and these writers who came during pre-colonial period were cannot intrinsically be labeled as Dalit writers, they often expressed a certain level of exasperation and frustration with the solid, almost impenetrable social systems of Odisha, and try to change them in their, or at least speak against those systems of caste and hierarchy and oppression in their writings. These were not highly developed anti-caste literature or Dalit literature, but they had the first beginnings, the first murmuring, the first hints, the first ideas about Dalit literature could be traced back to these writers who belonged to a lower caste and wrote about their own experiences while incorporating them in the larger epics. So the most important among them was the Sarala Das, who was not only wrote the Ramayana and the Mahabharata in Oriya literature, but also was the first poet in Oriya itself. Further, after Sarala Das, the medieval Oriya sage poets also hailed from the lower orders of society, and most of them prefer to identify themselves as Shudra Munis, as Munis of the Shudras. So, saints, sages, but sages of the Shudra caste, not of the upper caste. Though born in different castes, most of the Panch Shakhas, who constituted as the five major poets of the Oriya culture, also identified themselves as Shudras and Shudra Munis in their writings. These Shudra Munis were primarily saint poets or Bhakti Kavis who had protested against the stigma of contemporary society through their literature. They urged and demanded equality of all people in front of God and challenged the discrimination based on caste and gender. Though the discrimination that they challenged was not primarily on the social basis, it sowed the seeds of what we can see later as a manifestation of Dalit literature. These medieval Bhakti poets became the first to articulate an anti-caste sentiment in Oriya literature. So, while there were movements and incidents of protest against the caste system in the poems of medieval Bhakti poets, there was no systematic development of Oriya Dalit literature in pre-colonial times. Prior to the coming of the Britishers, there was no development of Oriya Dalit literature. The emergence of the modern Dalit literature is marked by a simultaneous development of Dalit consciousness in the public sphere, which demanded access to places of worship. So one needs to understand this. What we know as modern Dalit literature, it is significantly different from pre-colonial forms of Dalit literature because it is not only a literary movement, it is not only confined to literature in poetry, drama, plays, or novels or autobiographies. Instead, it is a social movement, a movement that seeks to change the way society is structured and governed, in which the way the politics functions in the society. And one of the ways in which it wanted to change politics and society was by allowing or by arguing and protesting against the fact that Dalits were not allowed in temples. One of the significant aspects of our history has been that Dalits and the lower caste community has always been kept outside the places of worship. They have never been allowed to step into places of worship such as the temple. And the Oriya landscape, not just literature, but the social and political landscape was or Dalit literature was being shaped by this larger context, and how this larger context changed over time. One significant in the history of this larger social context was Gandhi's attempt to enter the Jagannath temple with a group of Dalits. However, as Surata Kumar Malik writes in essay, Gandhi's tour to Odisha in 1934 was unsuccessful, and he was finally denied entry into the Jagannath temple of Puris with a group of Dalits. Mohan Nayak, a Congress Dalit leader who had ventured to take a group of Dalits into the temple in 1948, was beaten up and thrown out by the Brahmin Pandas. So it was an unsuccessful event, the Gandhi's attempt to enter the Jagannath temple with a group of Dalits. But this unsuccessful attempt laid the seeds for a larger social transformation that was happened much later, where these temples had to open their gates through Supreme Court orders, through legal interventions, to development of society in general, to large number of Dalit groups. A similar incident finds a contemporary manifestation in Kerala temple entry movement, when a Dalit girl was humiliated for entering the temple, leading to a widespread protest which ensured the intervention of courts to permanently allow and safeguard the rights of Dalits to enter the temple. So what we see is that Dalit literature develops in an environment where there is also a social movement arguing for the equality and justice for Dalits. And this is what we encounter in Dalit literature in Odisha also. And there the movement was primarily confined to arguing for temple entry for Dalits. The social change in Odisha gave birth to a new kind of Dalit consciousness, inspired by the figures of Gandhi and Ambedkar and the various Dalit movements across the country, especially in Maharashtra. As I've said before, Maharashtra was the center of Dalit movement. It was the one that gave birth to the Dalit Panthers Party. It was the one that had the most robust literature produced around Dalit issues. And in some ways, it also became the focal point for all other states and languages when, as a form of inspiration or motivation on how to run a Dalit movement. And so the various Dalit movements across the country, especially Maharashtra, gave birth to prominent Dalit voices in literature such as Basudev Sunani. So it is the social change instituted by Gandhi and Ambedkar, the movements that were happening across the country, primarily in Maharashtra and Tamil Nadu, that gave birth to prominent Dalit voices in literature such as Basudev Sunani, who we will encounter in today's lecture, whose poem we will study in today's lecture. So, Basudev Sunani was born in an extremely poor region of Noapada. You know, Noapada is an area that is known for being one of the poorest regions, not only in India, but in the entire world. It is situated near the Kalahandi district. Earlier, it was part of the Kalahandi district. Kalahandi district is known for its persistent famines and droughts, and therefore it is a place afflicted with pain and suffering, with hunger and death. Jagannath Prasad Das describes the region of Kalahandi in one of his poems, where he states, "Wherever there is hunger, there Kalahandi is. Wherever you stare, there Kalahandi is, in the sunken eyes of living skeletons, in rags which do not cover the frail bodies, in the utensils pawned off for food, in the crumbling huts with unthatched roofs, in the exclusive prosperity of having owned two earthen pots." So what is Kalahandi? Kalahandi is a state or a district where human beings are reduced to living skeletons, where their rags that they wear, the clothes that they wear, refuse to or fail to cover their frail bodies, where people sell off children for to get some money, where women are sold off to prostitution, a place that has constantly faced drought, famine in the 75 years of Indian independence. It is from such a land that Basudev Sunani comes, and it is such an environment that had a profound impact on the life of Basudev Sunani. As he states in one of his interviews, "Even before I started writing, I was well aware of hunger. The place I have come from, Kalahandi, is rife with hunger. My love for my people grew as I realized how well they hide their hunger." So it is this persistent struggle to stay alive, this immense hunger that afflicts not only a particular family or a particular individual or a particular caste, but the entire region itself is what constitutes as the background of Basudev Sunani's poetry. It is from here that he borrows some of the hints, ideas, characters that characterize his poetry. He writes, as a child, Basudev Sunani grew fascinated with poetry because of the songs his father sang. He says in one of the interviews, and I'm quoting from here, during my primary career, I was going with my father to cultivating land to take care of the crop. My father used to wake up early in the morning every day and get warm from the wood fire near the temporary thatched tent and go on singing. He was singing so beautifully that I was almost became impressed. I silently listened to the songs. Once I could not resist my enthusiasm and asked him, "Who is the writer of these songs?" My father answered me, "It is the poets." From that day onwards, I had an understanding that poets are some extraordinary human beings, maybe having some different kind of body structure and certainly a different mind. It is this encounter of the little child and this conversation with the little child that he has with his father, where the father keeps on singing kavi, he's singing bhakti poetry. And one needs to recognize and identify that what Vasudev Sunani would have heard during his childhood would have been the poems of the Sarala Das. And the poems that incorporated or at least sowed the seeds of anti-caste literature in pre-colonial times. It is these poems that his father is singing, and he listens to them so impressed by their tune, by their articulation, by their music, that he asks his father, who has written these songs, and the father says they're written by the poets. And this little boy is inspired to become a poet from that. Sunani's father recited songs from the Bhakti tradition, perhaps the songs of early Oriya poets who were the first to articulate a disillusionment with caste, and these songs became a window for Sunani to the world of poetry. He became so enamored with these songs that he himself entered into a world of poetry. He personally belonged to the dome caste of Western of Orissa, and his Dalit voice and his perspective is noticeable throughout his poetic work. The themes of his poems, the characters that inhabit his imaginary landscape, are all belonging to largely the Dalit community. And through all of them, he voices a concern for the Dalit identity, the Dalit people in his poems. The poems of Basudev Sunani are filled with marginalized characters that represent his region and community, such as goat herds, farmers, petty politicians, all subsiding to the close to the poverty line. He writes almost exclusively on the lives of his people. So Basudev Sunani writes about the uniqueness and the untranslatability of the Dalit experience. He urges that it is a form of humiliation that cannot be understood, shared, or articulated by non-Dalits. He believes that what Dalits go through cannot be understood, articulated, or shared by the upper caste individuals. He states in one of his interviews that Dalit consciousness cannot be shared by non-Dalits. It is a stupendous task for even a Dalit writer to present it before those who do not have the experience of it, especially through poetry. Yesterday's Shudra is today's Dalit, untouchable. It is inhuman. The upper caste people cannot fathom the humiliation and untouchable grows. So there is almost this uniqueness in the Dalit experience that he sees, and untranslatability, and the attempt that Basudev Sunani as a writer has is to transform that untranslatable experience, that uniqueness of the Dalit identity, into a poetic verse that can be felt and experienced by upper caste individuals, by all individuals, and that can help them to understand the pain and the misery and the suffering that constitutes Dalit experience. Yet, while there is a Dalit identity, the poetry comes not from his identity, but also from the deep recesses of the self that is marked by identity and yet remains away from it. So, while the poetry is about the Dalit identity, it does not only come from Dalit identity or Dalit politics, it comes from somewhere else. And this somewhere else is bookmarked by the Dalit identity and yet cannot be pointed out where it is located. It comes from the deep recesses of the self, and it is marked by identity and yet has remained away from it. He states in the interview, "You cannot force a subject to be your poem. Your consciousness and feeling have a kind of perception through which events, situation, and sights are filtered into your heart, and at some point they erupt as poems." It's very interesting use of a verb, erupt. Events, situation, social context, identity, they are filtered into your heart. They are seen by the eyes, filtered by the heart, and at certain moments they erupt as poems. It is only the theme that directs the poet to present a poem in a particular way. In this process of making a poem, the poet does not have much of a role. So the theme, the context, the perception, the ideas, the event, the situation, all of them are seen by the writer, filtered by the heart, and then erupted as poems. In these statements, we encounter Sunani not only as a poet but also as a profound thinker who has intellectually engaged about the issues of caste and identity for decades. It is this intellectual engagement that finds expression in his theoretical book on caste titled Dalit, Capitalism and Globalization. So he's not only a writer of Dalit literature, he is also an intellectual who has written books on Dalit identity, such as the one titled Dalit, Capitalism and Globalization, where he theorizes some of these ideas about caste in his book. So, now, before moving on to Basudev Sunani's poem, one needs to understand one basic element about his poetry, which is irony. As we are moving through the course, there is not only a change in the language of these poems, but also a change in the theme. We're not only moving from Telugu poems to Kannada poems to Oriya poems, we're also changing the themes of the poem, the tone, the form of expression that characterizes Dalit poetry. We are looking at Dalit poetry in all its diversity. We have moved away from the exasperation of Sunny Kavikar's poems, the demand for self-respect that is embodied in Kalikuri Prasad's poem, the deep sense of humiliation in Venkataraman's poems, to an absolute new tone and subjectivity that is encountered in Basudev Sunani's poems. His poems are an expression of a distant, ironical perspective that mocks and derides the social situation and the political framework that is the characteristic of a casteist society. So that the tone of the poem has moved away from through the emotions of anger, self-respect and humiliation to finally arrive at a junction of irony and to provide in Basudev Sunani's terse verse an ironic view of life. So if there is one thing that characterizes his poetry, while we have seen some poets, their poems are characterized by anger, there are others which are characterized for a demand of self-respect, the other by a feeling of humiliation. His poetry is characterized by a sense of irony. We will deal with what irony actually means, but let us look at his poem. It is titled A Coaching Center. O learned men, you surely know that impurities of touch completely dissolve when a high caste man takes a dip in water and changes his clothes. But look at the untouchable hosts, howsoever much they rub themselves with soap and water and splash and dip and scrub and polish, they cannot shake off untouchability, which clings to their bodies. That is how and why they have remained untouchables over the millennia. No one has been able to decide if untouchability is a color or a touch, a feeling or an ideal, whether it resides in the one who touches or the one who is touched. A learned high caste man should start a coaching center and make good money if he could simply teach untouchables how to shake off untouchability with a single dip in water and a change of clothes. Let us understand the meaning of the word irony before progressing with the analysis of the poem. Irony is the expression of one's meaning by using language that normally signifies the opposite, typically for humorous or emphatic effect. What does this mean? Therefore, irony is a state where something is said. Therefore, irony is a state where something is said, but its opposite is implied. It is a situation where words and meaning break the intrinsic bond that they have with each other. The literal meaning of the word becomes irrelevant and the opposite meaning turns out to be true. For instance, let us take the first line of the poem, O learned men. The sentence underlines the fact that the poem is addressed to an implied audience, an audience of the learned men of the world. If we take the line literally, it marks out that the poem is addressed to the people who are educated and learned. However, this line is being used in an ironic way, so that the implication is that the poem is being addressed to unlearned and uneducated men. It is this tension between the meaning and the words that characterizes irony. Basically, it means when the poet uses a certain term, he implies the opposite of that term in his poem. The use of irony is the implicate when one uses one word but implies another, and generally what one implies is the opposite of what one says. So when he's saying "O learned men," he's implying "O unlearned men," "O uneducated men." So this is irony. And in some ways, both the meanings, it is not that the meaning that is present in the word itself, which is learned, goes away. In some ways, the learned and the unlearned, the educated and the uneducated, in an ironical sentence, are constantly in conflict with each other. The implication is that people who are considered learned and educated, officially, socially, politically, people who are considered learned and uneducated are actually obsessed with the idea of caste and purity, and therefore, in real terms, are uneducated. And these people are the powerful majority of the country, the upper caste individuals who control social, economic, political power, but are still adherents and believers of purity and impurity that characterizes the caste system. So, old learned men becomes a way of ironically referring to upper caste individuals and showcasing that they are not learned but uneducated. So, let us see how the point progresses. O learned men, you surely know that impurities of touch completely dissolve when a high caste man takes a dip in water and changes his clothes. The idea of impurity lies at the heart of the caste system, and it is an idea that lies at the heart of the poem also. The caste system is determined by pure and impure. Certain acts are pure, certain acts are impure. But more importantly, certain people are pure and certain people are impure. And when you come into touch with those certain people who are impure, you become impure. So it is this absurdity of impurity that the poem looks at, this idea of impurity, and tries to study it closely in order to understand what it actually means. The aim of the poem is to highlight how the idea of impurity is an absurd notion that is applied differentially to the upper caste and the lower caste. The first absurdity of the idea of impurity is that it is not seen for everyone. If an upper caste becomes impure, they can go and take a dip in the water, they can wash themselves and they will become pure. Whereas an lower caste is never able to break out of that impurity. While the upper caste can dissolve impurities by taking a dip in the water or by changing their clothes, the impurities remain attached to the very self, the very identity of the lower caste themselves. What is this impurity that for one works in a different way, for other works in a different way? But look at the untouchable hosts, howsoever much they rub themselves with soap and water, with splash and dip, and scrub and polish, they cannot shake off untouchability which clings to their bodies. Even if the lower caste individuals rub themselves with soap and water, dip and splash themselves in a pool and scrub their entire body from top to toe, they are unable to remove the impurities of touch that cling to their bodies. The aim of the poem is to showcase that in the case of the upper caste individual, impurity is transitional, incidental, and momentary. It happens for few moments, it happens for an incident, and it happens in a transitionally moment. Whereas in the lower caste individuals, it leaves an indelible, permanent mark that cannot be shaken off the bodies. While highlighting the contradictory ways in which the impurities are treated, the poem seeks to convey that impurity in itself is a social construct. What the poet is trying to imply is that since impurity is not stable, it changes from one person to another, it in itself is a social construct. It is not an objective idea that affects individual, but a social phenomena created to maintain the power, the hegemony, and the control of the upper caste over the lower caste. So this is how the poem progresses. That is how and why they have remained untouchables over the millennia. No one has been able to decide if untouchability is a color or a touch, a feeling or an ideal, whether it resides in the one who touches or the one who is touched. In this stanza, the poet takes the idea to a philosophical sophistication in order to question where exactly the impurity and the untouchability lies. The poet poses a series of questions such as, what is the essence of untouchability? How do we actually determine its intrinsic nature? Is untouchability a form of color, or is it a form of touch? Is it a feeling that one has for someone else, or is it an abstract ideal constructed in the minds of few people? These are all rhetorical questions. What is untouchability? Is it color, touch, feeling, ideal? Does it reside in the one who touches, or does it reside in the one who is touched? And ironically, these are not questions that the poet seeks answer. This is not arguments, this is mock arguments. These arguments are supposed to show the hollowness, the absurdity of the claims of what untouchability is. These are all what we call as rhetorical questions. Rhetorical questions are those whose aim is not to get a particular answer, but to showcase the hollowness of the question itself. And the aim of these series of questions is to showcase the absurdity of the idea of untouchability as it resides neither in the color nor in the touch, neither in a feeling nor in an ideal, neither in the one who touches nor in the one who is touched. Untouchability is a hollow concept that resides only in the heart of people who uphold the caste system and support untouchability. Has no existence outside the minds and hearts of individuals who engage in untouchability. So, with this, the poem takes us to an ending. It is an ironical tone. The author never says that untouchability is an absurd idea, but every line, every sentence, every stanza in the poem implies that it is an absurd, irrelevant, absolutely, mockable idea that has no existence in modern times. And then the poem takes us to the end. A learned high caste man could start a coaching center and make good money if he could simply teach untouchables how to shake off untouchability with a single dip in water and a change of clothes. Even though the writer has underlined the absurdity of untouchability, he finds ignorance about the topic. He says, I do not know how to get rid of untouchability. The upper caste perhaps know it, but I do not know how to get rid of untouchability. And I would suggest that an upper caste should start a coaching center where he could teach the lower caste about how to get rid of untouchability. He pretends that he knows nothing about untouchability and pretends that he is unable to answer any question about the topic. Therefore, in an ironic tone, he urges an upper caste individual to start a coaching center that could teach the lower caste the path of shaking off untouchability through a dip in water or by changing a pair of clothes. So it is an ironic comment on a lot of things, but primarily it is also an ironic comment in the education system itself. The idea of the coaching center also highlights Basudev Sunani's ironic comments on the modern education system. Coaching centers are institutes that embody the capitalization of knowledge. They showcase that education can be bought with money. While schools are inclusive, because schools are meant for everyone, these coaching institutions are by very nature exclusionary. The door of these institutions are open only for the rich and the wealthy who can afford to go to coaching center after going to their school. So, however, it is not that these institutions have some great libraries of knowledge. Instead, they are centers of businesses that have commodified and commercialized education. Therefore, the ironic comment is not only that an upper caste can teach a lower caste about how to get rid of untouchability because there is nothing to be taught. Because the Institute of Untouchability or the institution of untouchability is built not on principles of logic that can be taught, not on principles of ideas that can be educated to other people. It is built on power and social relations that are seek to still maintain the power of the upper caste people. But in some ways, the coaching centers are also that. Coaching centers are not centers of knowledge, not centers where great books are written or high flow knowledge is created. They are centers where knowledge is commodified and commercialized. They are centers where knowledge is made exclusionary. They are centers where some people in this country are told that they can go to a coaching center and whereas the rest are told that they cannot afford one. So coaching centers are markers of exclusion, like the caste system itself. The caste system is a marker of exclusion in the traditional sense. Coaching centers are markers of exclusion in the modern sense. They exclude people cannot afford them, and therefore the writer says the coaching center is not created to spread knowledge. It is created to make good money. Let us read the line again. A learned high caste man could start a coaching center and make good money if he could simply teach untouchables how to shake off untouchability with a single dip in water and a change of clothes. So these coaching centers are not centers of learning, not centers of education, not centers of spreading of knowledge. They are centers where money is minted, and money is minted by the powerful, the rich, and money is minted by making sure that the education remains exclusionary and does not fall into the hands of the poor and the uneducated. And it is this ironical tone that takes shape in the last stanza, where in some ways the exclusions of the traditional system of caste system are juxtaposed with the exclusions of the modern systems of coaching center, both of them highlighting not some logical principle behind them, but just exclusionary principles that seek to keep some people in power and some people out of power. That is what lies at the essence of Basudev Sunani's poem, Coaching Center. The exclusions that are part of traditional, ideas, but also part of modern societies, and those exclusions based on caste and coaching center that highlight and mark out our society. So, with this, we come to the conclusion of today's lecture. Basudev Sunani, as I've just summarized what we have covered in the lecture, Basudev Sunani was born into a Dalit family in the undivided district of Kalahandi, a place known for its utmost poverty, and the environment of that space, along with the struggles of the individuals, came to shape his identity and to shape his poetry. Basudev Sunani is a poet who became enamored with poetry while listening to the song his father sang while working in the fields, and this childhood experience inspired him to become a poet. Basudev Sunani's poems have an ironic outlook to life, and his poems work by using wordplay and creating situations that reveal the internal absurdities of our social system. The poem Coaching Centers mocks the idea of impurity and satirizes the new structures of education that are constructed and dominated by upper caste individuals, which are meant to always exclude other people and to maintain their dominance, to maintain their power in the social world. For this lecture, I referred to two particular interviews with Basudev Sunani. One was published in Writers in Conversation and the other was published in Poetry International. Thank you everyone. See you in the next lecture.